Imagine waking up in the year 1850 with a fever so severe your body is trembling, your skin is burning, and you can barely lift your head off the pillow. You call for help and a doctor arrives at your door. He looks serious. He nods slowly. He reaches into his bag and pulls out a blade, not to perform surgery, not to remove something dangerous. He is going to cut open your arm and let your blood pour out into a bowl, because, in his professional medical opinion, your blood has gone bad, and draining it out of your body is the cure. This was not a horror story. This was standard medical practice. This was the world of medicine before everything we know today existed, and it is far stranger, far darker, and far more fascinating than most people ever realize. The history of medicine is not a simple story of progress. It is a story of brilliant minds working in total darkness, of discoveries made completely by accident, of soldiers dying on battlefields not from bullets, but from infected wounds that a simple pill could have saved, and of a world where the difference between a doctor and a murderer was sometimes frighteningly thin. To understand how medicine works today, you first have to understand the terrifying world it came from, and the extraordinary chain of events, wars, accidents, and moments of desperate genius that brought us here. Let us go back to the 1800s. The early 19th century was a world where medicine was built almost entirely on ideas inherited from ancient Greece. A Greek physician named Galen, who lived nearly 2,000 years ago, had proposed that the human body was controlled by four substances he called humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. When you were sick, it meant these humors were out of balance. The cure was to restore balance. If you had too much blood, you bled the patient. If you had too much of something else, you gave them substances to make them vomit or purge their bowels. This theory was wrong in every possible way, and yet it dominated Western medicine for over 1,500 years. Doctors across Europe and America in the 1800s were still practicing bloodletting with complete confidence, using either lancets to slice open veins or creatures called leeches, small worm-like animals that attached to the skin and drank blood. Thousands of patients were bled until they lost consciousness. Some of the most famous people in history died not from their illnesses but from the treatment. George Washington, the first president of the United States, fell ill with a throat infection in 1799. His doctors bled him repeatedly over the course of a single day, removing nearly half the blood in his body. He died within hours. The very men trying to save him almost certainly killed him faster. Pain was another nightmare entirely. Before the discovery of anesthesia, surgery was performed on fully conscious patients. Think about that for a moment. A surgeon needed to amputate a leg, and the patient was awake for every cut of the saw through bone. Surgeons in this era were judged not by their precision but by their speed, because the faster the operation, the less the patient suffered. The fastest surgeons in history could amputate a limb in under 90 seconds. Patients were held down by strong assistants. Some were given alcohol to dull the pain slightly. Others were given opium, which helped somewhat but left them fully conscious and aware of what was happening to them. The screams from surgical theaters could be heard outside the building. People who needed operations would sometimes refuse them and choose to die of their illness instead, because the surgery itself seemed worse than death. When ether was first used as an anesthetic in 1846, it was genuinely considered one of the greatest gifts ever given to humanity. For the first time in human history, a patient could be made unconscious before an operation. Surgeons wept with relief. Patients woke up having felt nothing. It sounds obvious to us now, but to the people of that era, it was nothing short of miraculous. But anesthesia alone could not save people, because there was another killer lurking in every hospital, one that nobody could see and nobody fully understood. That killer was infection. In the mid-1800s, hospitals were places where people went to die, not because medicine was helpless, but because hospitals themselves were death traps filled with invisible danger. Surgeons operated in their street clothes, wearing aprons stiff with dried blood from previous operations as a badge of honor showing their experience. They did not wash their hands between patients. Surgical instruments were reused without cleaning. Wounds were dressed with used bandages. The mortality rate after surgery in many hospitals exceeded 50%, meaning more than half of all surgical patients died afterward. Not from the surgery itself, but from the infections that followed. A Hungarian doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis made one of the most heartbreaking discoveries in medical history in 1847. He was working in a maternity ward in Vienna and noticed that the death rate among mothers delivering babies in the ward run by doctors and medical students was dramatically higher than in the ward run by midwives. He investigated and realized the difference. The doctors and students were coming directly from performing autopsies on dead bodies to delivering babies without washing their hands. They were carrying something from the corpses into the bodies of the mothers. He introduced mandatory hand washing with a chlorinated lime solution, and the death rate in his ward dropped from around 10% to under 2% almost immediately. He had discovered, without knowing it, the basic principle of germ theory. He saved hundreds of lives with this single change, and the medical establishment refused to believe him. They mocked him, ignored him, and eventually had him committed to a mental institution. He died there at the age of 47, reportedly from an infection, possibly from the very kind of bacteria he had spent his life trying to warn people about. It took Joseph Lister, a British surgeon, working in the 1860s and 1870s to finally turn the tide. Lister had read the work of Louis Pasteur, a French chemist who had been proving that fermentation and decay were caused by invisible microorganisms, tiny living things too small to see with the naked eye. Lister connected Pasteur's work to surgery. If microscopic creatures caused decay in food and wine, perhaps they also caused decay in wounds. He began using carbolic acid as a disinfectant in surgical theaters, spraying it on wounds, on instruments on his hands, and into the air during operations. The results were dramatic. Infection rates collapsed. Patients survived surgeries that would have killed them months before. Lister was initially met with skepticism and ridicule from much of the medical community, but over time, the evidence became impossible to ignore. Antiseptic surgery transformed medicine and made modern hospitals possible. During this same era, another invisible war was being fought, one that would eventually change the entire trajectory of human civilization. For most of human history, the greatest killers were not predators or wars but infectious diseases. Smallpox killed an estimated 300 million people in the 20th century alone. Cholera swept through cities in waves, killing thousands within days. Typhoid, tuberculosis, diphtheria, measles, these diseases claimed the lives of children in numbers that are almost impossible to comprehend today. A family in the 1800s might expect to lose several children before they reached adulthood. Cemeteries were full of small graves. Edward Jenner had made a critical discovery in 1796 when he noticed that milkmaids who contracted cowpox, a mild disease from cattle, seemed to be immune to smallpox. He deliberately infected a young boy with cowpox material and then exposed him to smallpox. The boy did not get sick. Jenner had invented vaccination, though it would take another century for scientists to fully understand why it worked. Louis Pasteur expanded on this work dramatically, developing vaccines for chicken cholera, anthrax, and most dramatically, rabies. In 1885, Pasteur used his rabies vaccine on a 9-year-old boy who had been severely bitten by a rabid dog. The boy, Joseph Meister, survived. It was a global sensation. The age of vaccines had truly begun. But even as vaccines began to address some infectious diseases, there was still nothing to treat bacterial infections once they had taken hold inside the body. If bacteria entered a wound, entered the bloodstream, infected the lungs, there was almost nothing a doctor could do except watch and hope. This was the world into which the First World War arrived in 1914, and it was the world into which the Second World War was born 2 decades later. And it was in the crucible of those wars, especially the second one, that modern medicine was truly forged. The Second World War was the deadliest conflict in human history. Between 1939 and 1945, somewhere between 70 and 85 million people died, soldiers and civilians alike. The conditions soldiers fought in were horrific. Men spent weeks in muddy trenches and foxholes. Wounds from shrapnel, bullets, and explosives were contaminated with soil, clothing fibers, and foreign material. Without effective treatment for bacterial infection, even relatively minor wounds could become death sentences. Gas gangrene, an infection caused by bacteria that literally consumed living tissue and produced toxic gases, was one of the most feared conditions. A soldier could be wounded in the morning and dead by nightfall from rapidly spreading infection. The battlefield medicine of World War II was organized around a concept called triage, a French word meaning to sort. With limited medical personnel and overwhelming numbers of casualties, doctors and medics had to make rapid decisions about who to treat first. The most lightly wounded who could return to duty quickly were treated first and sent back. The most severely wounded who were unlikely to survive were given comfort care and left to die. Those in the middle, the ones who could survive with immediate treatment, received priority care. It was a brutal arithmetic of survival, but it was also a rational one given the circumstances. Field medics were among the bravest and most vital figures of the war. Often unarmed, moving across open ground under fire to reach wounded soldiers, they would apply pressure bandages, splint broken bones, inject morphine for pain, and prepare casualties for transport to the rear. The morphine injections given by medics were crucial. Morphine, derived from opium, was one of the few effective pain medications available, and it allowed seriously wounded men to survive the agonizing process of being transported from the battlefield to a field hospital without going into shock from pain alone. Field hospitals were mobile surgical units positioned close enough to the front lines to receive casualties quickly, but far enough back to be out of immediate danger. Speed was everything. The concept of the golden hour, the idea that a trauma patient's chance of survival is dramatically higher if they receive surgical care within 1 hour of being wounded, was being discovered empirically on these battlefields. Surgeons in field hospitals worked under brutal conditions, operating by lantern light, intense, sometimes under artillery fire, performing amputations and abdominal surgeries on men who had been wounded hours earlier on the front lines. And then came penicillin. The story of penicillin begins in 1928 in a London laboratory, when a Scottish bacteriologist named Alexander Fleming returned from vacation to find that one of his Petri dishes had been contaminated by a mold. Around the mold, the bacteria he had been growing were dead, dissolved in a clear ring. The mold was producing something that killed bacteria. Fleming called the substance penicillin, published his findings, and then largely moved on. He could not figure out how to produce it in sufficient quantities or how to stabilize it, and for over a decade, it remained little more than an interesting curiosity. It was Australian pharmacologist Howard Florey and German-born biochemist Ernst Chain who finally cracked the problem in 1940 and 1941. Working at Oxford, they developed methods to purify and concentrate penicillin, tested it on mice infected with lethal bacteria, and watched in astonishment as the mice survived. They tested it on a human patient in 1941, a police officer named Albert Alexander, who was dying of a severe infection that had begun from a scratch from a rose thorn. Within days of receiving penicillin, Alexander began to recover dramatically. Then the penicillin ran out because it was so difficult to produce that the team had been recycling it from the patient's own urine. Alexander relapsed and died. But the proof of concept was undeniable. The challenge became production. How do you manufacture penicillin at a scale that could treat thousands of wounded soldiers? The answer came from an unlikely partnership between British scientists and American pharmaceutical companies. In 1943, the United States government organized a massive industrial effort to produce penicillin, involving dozens of companies and laboratories working simultaneously. By D-Day in June 1944, when Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, enough penicillin existed to treat every Allied casualty in the invasion. Soldiers who would have died of infected wounds in the First World War survived in the Second World War because of penicillin. The death rate from bacterial pneumonia among wounded soldiers, which had been around 18% in World War I, fell to less than 1% in World War II. Penicillin alone may have saved the lives of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Blood transfusion was another medical revolution accelerated by war. The basic concept of transfusing blood from one person to another had been attempted since the 17th century, usually with disastrous results, because scientists did not yet understand blood types. Karl Landsteiner discovered the ABO blood type system in 1901, making safe transfusions possible in theory. But the practical challenges of storing and transporting blood meant that early transfusions were done directly from donor to patient. During the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, Canadian physician Norman Bethune developed one of the world's first mobile blood transfusion services, delivering refrigerated stored blood directly to the front lines. This concept was refined and massively expanded during World War II. Blood banks were established, blood drives organized civilian populations to donate, and refrigerated blood was transported to field hospitals across multiple continents. Soldiers who would have bled to death on the battlefield now had a chance if medics could keep them alive long enough to reach a hospital. The war also accelerated the development of plasma, the liquid component of blood stripped of its red blood cells. Plasma could be dried into powder, stored without refrigeration, and reconstituted with water on the battlefield. It could not carry oxygen the way whole blood could, but it could restore blood volume and treat shock, keeping a severely wounded soldier alive long enough to receive proper treatment. Plasma saved tens of thousands of lives during World War II and laid the groundwork for modern intensive care medicine. What the Second World War did, in essence, was take decades' worth of medical theory and compress it into 6 years of desperate life and death experimentation on a global scale. Techniques that might have taken generations to develop and refine under normal circumstances were instead invented, tested, modified, and perfected at the speed of necessity. The field hospitals of 1944 would have been unrecognizable to a military surgeon from 1914, let alone from 1850. And the hospitals they evolved into, the modern hospitals of today, would appear to both as something from another world entirely. Today, a patient arriving at a modern hospital with a severe bacterial infection receives antibiotics that can clear the infection within days. A patient undergoing major surgery is put under general anesthesia that renders them completely unconscious, feeling nothing, while carefully calibrated medications maintain their heart rate, blood pressure, and breathing with extraordinary precision. Surgeons operate using techniques that in some cases never require cutting the body open at all, guiding tiny cameras and instruments through small incisions. Watching their work on high-definition screens. A patient whose heart stops can sometimes be resuscitated. A patient who cannot breathe can be placed on a mechanical ventilator that breathes for them. Organs that have failed can be replaced with transplants from donors. Medical imaging has given doctors a window into the living human body that would have seemed like magic 200 years ago. An X-ray machine, which uses radiation to image dense structures like bones, was invented in 1895 and was initially considered so extraordinary that people thought the first images must be fakes. CT scanners create three-dimensional images of the body's interior by taking hundreds of X-rays from different angles and combining them. MRI machines use powerful magnetic fields and radio waves to create extraordinarily detailed images of soft tissues, allowing doctors to see tumors, damaged tissue, and abnormalities that are completely invisible to any other technology. What a Victorian doctor would have given to have seen inside the human body without cutting it open. And now, at this precise moment in history, artificial intelligence is beginning to enter medicine in ways that may ultimately prove as transformative as antibiotics or anesthesia. AI systems can examine medical images and identify cancers, aneurysms, and other abnormalities with an accuracy that sometimes surpasses human specialists. Machine learning algorithms trained on vast databases of patient records can identify patterns that predict which patients are at risk of developing certain conditions years before symptoms appear. Surgical robots guided by surgeons allow operations of extraordinary precision in locations and at scales that human hands alone could never achieve. The line from the bloodletting physicians of the 1800s to the AI-assisted surgeons of today is one of the most remarkable journeys in human history. It is a journey driven not by a smooth and orderly march of progress, but by desperate necessity, by accidents of discovery, by wars that killed millions, and in doing so forced the invention of techniques that would save millions more. Every time a patient today survives an infection that would have killed their great-great-grandparents, every time a surgeon performs an operation that leaves a patient completely unaware it even happened, every time a blood transfusion gives a trauma patient a second chance at life, it is the echo of all those centuries of trial and error, of brilliant and sometimes tragic figures working in the dark, of soldiers dying in field hospitals while scientists worked frantically in laboratories, trying to find something, anything, that could tip the balance between life and death. The next time you take an antibiotic, think of Alexander Fleming returning from vacation to find a mold that was killing bacteria in a petri dish. The next time you are put under anesthesia, think of the surgical patients of 1845 who chose death over the operating table. The next time a doctor washes their hands before examining you, think of Ignaz Semmelweis dying in an asylum because he told the world something it was not ready to hear. Medicine did not arrive fully formed. It was built, piece by piece, in places as different as a London laboratory and a Normandy field hospital, by people who were sometimes celebrated and sometimes ridiculed, sometimes lucky and sometimes desperate. And it is still being built right now, in laboratories and hospitals and research facilities all over the world, by people trying to solve the problems we have not yet solved, fighting the diseases we have not yet conquered, pushing back the darkness one discovery at a time.